The operating theater is designed to be a sanctuary of absolute order. If you close your eyes and visualize it, you can almost hear the hum of the ventilation, the rhythmic beep of the monitor, and the sharp, metallic click of stainless steel instruments being laid onto a sterile tray. It is a cold environment, precise and unforgiving. Tonight, on this episode of Noir Sleep Detective, we are going to walk into that room, but we are not looking for a monster hiding in the shadows. We are examining a failure of the light itself. To become a neurosurgeon in the United States, a candidate must survive a gauntlet that is arguably the most rigorous training regimen in modern medicine. It is a 14-year tunnel of sleepless nights and high-stakes examinations. One must memorize the geographical map of the human body, the location of every cranial nerve, the delicate architecture of every vessel, the precise load-bearing capacity of every vertebrae. This process acts as a filter. It is a mechanism designed by the medical board, theoretically, to remove the incompetent, to weed out the reckless, and to ensure that by the time a person stands over an exposed spine with a scalpel in hand, they are incapable of making a fundamental error. We trust this system. When we are wheeled into surgery, sedated and vulnerable, we offer our total trust to the credentials hanging on the wall. We assume that the filter worked. And yet, there is an impossible contradiction we must address tonight. In 2012, inside a brightly lit operating room in Dallas, Texas, a man stood over a patient. On paper, he was a prodigy. He possessed an MD, a PhD, and had completed a residency at a top-tier program in Tennessee. He had published papers. He had investors. He had the white coat and the heavy title. But as he began to work, a terrifying disconnect emerged, a cognitive dissonance that the other staff members in the room could scarcely comprehend. The man with all the right credentials appeared not to know the difference between a muscle and a spinal cord. He was living two lives, one on paper as a genius researcher, and another in the operating room where he was a total stranger to the scalpel. I want you to imagine you are a scrub nurse in that room. You are watching his hands. You see the hesitation, or perhaps the lack of it. You see sweat beading on a forehead, not from the exertion of a difficult tumor, but from the chaotic fumbling of basic anatomy. It prompts a question I want you to consider as we settle into this true crime documentary. If you saw an expert behaving like a novice, would you speak up, or would the weight of his authority silence you? This is the psychological anchor of our story tonight. It is not just about one man. It is about the silence that surrounds him. Let us move forward in time, just briefly, to understand the magnitude of what was happening. We need to look at the evidence through the eyes of a true expert. Transport yourself to July 2012. We are at the Dallas Medical Center. Enter Dr. Robert Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a veteran spinal surgeon, a man who has spent decades respecting the delicate boundaries of the human nervous system. He has been called in to perform a salvage surgery, a rescue mission, on a patient named Mary Eford. She had been operated on by our subject just days prior, and she could no longer move her legs. Henderson is not looking for a crime scene. He is looking for a medical complication. He pulls up the post-operative CT scan. I want you to focus on what Henderson sees, because this is the moment the narrative gap closes with a sickening thud. In a standard spinal fusion, the hardware, the screws and rods serves a specific structural purpose. They are placed with mathematical precision into the bone to stabilize the column. But as Dr. Henderson studies the grayscale images on the light box, the forensic reality creates a sense of vertigo. He does not see a repair. He sees hardware floating in soft tissue, nowhere near the bone it was meant to anchor. He sees a nerve root, which should be protected at all costs, completely severed. He sees screw holes drilled into the wrong places, abandoned, and then drilled again. It did not look like surgery performed by a doctor who had a bad day. It looked, in Henderson's own estimation, like the work of a chaotic force, someone who had no understanding of the anatomy they were invading. The evidence suggests that the person who did this was virtually blind to the structures of the human body. For Dr. Henderson, this was not just malpractice, it was an assault. The how is clear in the imaging. The misplaced screws, the amputated nerve. But the why is the question that keeps us awake. How does a man spend nearly a decade and a half in training and produce a result that looks like this? This is where forensic science meets criminal psychology. Tonight, we are opening the complete file on Christopher Dunch to understand how the system failed to stop a killer in Scrubs. We will examine the childhood that shaped his ego, the residency that hid his flaws, and the institutional silence that allowed him to move from hospital to hospital. If you appreciate these deep forensic dives into the darker side of medicine, where we prioritize the investigation over the shock, kindly subscribe. Settle in. The investigation begins now. Listen to the sound of the rain against the glass for a moment. It is a steady, rhythmic pattern, much like the years of training a doctor must endure. If you are drifting off, let the sound of the engine settle into a low hum. We are leaving the chaotic scene in Dallas behind for a short while. We are reversing the timeline, turning the clock back 15 years, to travel to a place where the air was filled not with panic, but with promise. To understand the wreckage, we must first inspect the blueprint. We find ourselves in Memphis, at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. It is the mid-2000s. The setting is prestigious, academic, and deeply competitive. This is not a place for the average mind. It is a proving ground for the elite. And walking these halls, wearing a crisp, short white coat that would eventually lengthen with his status, is a young man named Christopher Dunch. If you were to meet him in the cafeteria during those years, or sit across from him in a library study carrel, you would not see a monster. You would see a star. I want you to experience the cognitive dissonance here. In criminal psychology, we often look for the outcast, the loner, the person on the fringe. Dunch was the opposite. He was the center of gravity. Let us look at the file labeled Credentials. It is hypnotic in its perfection. As I list these achievements, consider the sheer caloric energy required to obtain them. He was not just a medical student, he was a dual scholar. He was enrolled in an MD-PhD program, a grueling marathon that demands the candidate master both the clinical art of healing and the rigorous, data-driven world of scientific research. He graduated with honors, He was inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society, a distinction reserved for the top tier of medical graduates. He founded companies. He secured millions of dollars in grant funding. He published papers on stem cell research that promised to revolutionize how we treat spinal cord injuries. On paper, he was not just a doctor. He was an architect of the future. The program directors loved him. Why wouldn't they? He was charismatic, he was tireless, and he brought prestige to the institution. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had already won the game before the cards were even dealt. But here is where we must apply our forensic lens. There is a concept in evidence analysis called negative data, the things that are missing from the picture. Watch this. If you look closely at his residency schedule, a strange discrepancy appears. A neurosurgery residency is typically a hands-on apprenticeship. You learn to operate by operating. You spend thousands of hours standing in the OR, holding retractors, drilling bone, feeling the resistance of tissue under your fingers. It is a tactile education. But Christopher Dunch was different. Because he was so brilliant at research, because he was bringing in so much grant money, he was allowed to spend the vast majority of his time in the lab, not the operating theater. He was becoming a world-class scientist, but he was remaining a novice surgeon. The system, in its desire to nurture a genius, accidentally created a narrative gap. They assumed that because he could explain the molecular biology of a disc herniation, he could physically remove one. But knowing the chemistry of paint does not make you a master painter. And then the first crack in the sterile mask appeared. It was not a surgical error, not yet. It was behavioral. It is what we in the investigation business call leakage. During his residency, reports began to surface quietly in the margins of his file about his conduct. There were whispers of erratic behavior. There were moments where the confidence curdled into arrogance, and the energy looked less like ambition and more like chemical alteration. An anonymous complaint was filed. The details are hazy, protected by privacy laws, but the outcome is a matter of record. He was suspected of using cocaine while on duty. He was asked to take a drug test. Now, pause and ask yourself, if you were an innocent man, a doctor accused of something so career-ending, what would you do? You would take the test immediately to clear your name. Dunch refused. In the forensic timeline, this is a pivotal moment. A refusal is often interpreted as an admission. Instead of being expelled, instead of the system halting the machinery, he was sent to an impaired physicians program. He was placed in a diversionary loop, a mechanism designed to rehabilitate valuable assets. And make no mistake, he was an asset. The university had invested years and resources into him. To fail him was to lose that investment. He returned to the program after a few months, claiming he was cured, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, and the system, eager to believe the golden boy narrative, let him back in. This brings us to a standout strategy in his psychological profile: compartmentalization. He was able to separate his reality into two distinct boxes. In box A, he was the brilliant researcher, the future of neurosurgery, the man who would cure paralysis. In box B, he was a man struggling with substance use, a man who had barely touched a scalpel, a man who was terrified of being found out. He welded Box B shut and sat on top of it, smiling at his professors. But the most disturbing piece of evidence from this era is not what he did, but what his superiors wrote about him. When he finished his residency, a residency where he had performed less than a tenth of the surgeries a typical graduate would have completed, he needed letters of recommendation to get a job. You would expect these letters to be cautious. You would expect a note saying, "He is brilliant, but needs supervision." Instead, the program director wrote that Christopher Dunch was one of the best residents he had ever trained. He described him as exemplary. Why? This is a rhetorical question that haunts the medical community. Was it an act of kindness? Or was it a bureaucratic maneuver to pass the problem on to someone else? In the corporate world, they call it kicking the can down the road. In medicine, when that can is a surgeon who cannot operate, the consequences are catastrophic. So, Christopher Dunch left Tennessee. He packed his bags, his PhD, his glowing letters of recommendation, and his unearned confidence. He headed to Texas, a state with caps on malpractice lawsuits and a booming medical economy. He arrived in Dallas not as a student, but as a fully credentialed neurosurgeon. He carried the sterile mask of authority. Patients saw the white coat and felt safe. Hospitals saw the resume and saw profit. Nobody saw the void behind the eyes. As we close this chapter on his origin, I want you to sit with a heavy thought. The tragedy that is about to unfold in Texas was not inevitable because he was evil. It was inevitable because he was protected. The institutions designed to keep us safe were the very ones that handed him the knife. He is now in Dallas. The year is 2011. The stage is set. The rain is still falling, but the storm is about to break inside the operating room. In the next part of our sleep story, we will witness what happens when that theoretical knowledge crashes into the physical reality of human flesh. We will examine the case of a childhood friend who trusted Dunch with his life and the terrible price he paid for that trust. Stay with me. The investigation is deepening. We have arrived in Dallas. If you are listening to this as a sleep story, visualize the skyline. It is different from Memphis. It is sharper, taller, more aggressive. The lights of the Reunion Tower glow against the dark Texas sky, watching over a city that prides itself on commerce, on success, on being bigger. Christopher Dunch arrived here not just with a medical degree, but with a crushing weight that is often omitted from the glorious stories of medical residency. He carried debt. Specifically, he carried nearly $600,000 in debt. This is the catalyst. In forensic accounting, we often find that financial pressure acts as an accelerant. It takes a stable compound and turns it volatile. Dunch was no longer the protected student in the laboratory. He was a man who needed to bill. He needed to operate. The transition from the theoretical world of research to the transactional world of private practice is jarring. His ego, however, had not adjusted to his bank account. He believed he was already a titan of industry. He was pitching companies, seeking investors, trying to build an empire before he had even successfully repaired a single spine in private practice. But the most disturbing evidence from this period does not come from a bank statement. It comes from his own outbox. We need to examine a piece of digital evidence that creates a profound silence in the room whenever it is read aloud. It is an email sent by Dunch to an employee and former romantic partner. I want to read this to you. I will not use a dramatic voice. I will read it with the cold detachment of a court stenographer, because the words do not need embellishment. They are a map of his internal landscape. Listen closely to the language. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer. Let that settle in the air for a moment. In criminal psychology, we rarely see this. Usually, the perpetrator hides their intent. They wear a mask of normalcy. We call it impression management. A person with dark impulses usually works very hard to convince the world they are gentle. But here, we have a reversal. We have a healer, a man sworn to the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm explicitly stating his desire to become the antithesis of a doctor. Let us apply a forensic analysis to this text. We are not just looking at the words, we are looking at the state of mind required to type them. Is this a narcissistic collapse? A moment where the grandeur fails and the rage spills over? Or is it something chemical? The phrasing, "mix with everything else that I am," suggests a fragmented self-identity. He views his personality as a series of ingredients. He believes he can simply choose to remove goodness and replace it with killing. It implies a terrifying level of control, or perhaps a total delusion of control. Pay attention to this. Notice the specific phrase, cold-blooded. He does not say he wants to be reckless. He does not say he wants to be negligent. He specifies a lack of emotion. In the profile of an offender, this is a critical distinction. Negligence is a failure of skill. Being cold-blooded is a failure of empathy. It suggests that he viewed his patients not as people, but as obstacles, or worse, as biological material for his own experimentation. This email is a diagnostic symptom. It is the literary equivalent of a fever spike. And yet, nobody stopped him. The email was private. The world saw only the white coat. This brings us to the sunrise ritual. In a standard hospital environment, the morning rounds are a sacred time. It is quiet. The sun is just coming up. The team gathers to discuss the plan for the day. A surgeon typically arrives well-rested, mentally sharp, perhaps smelling of coffee and antiseptic soap. The witnesses who worked alongside Dunch in those early Dallas days describe a very different sensory experience. They describe a man who did not seem to operate on a circadian rhythm. There were reports of him partying late into the night, engaging in behavior that would exhaust a teenager, let alone a neurosurgeon responsible for human life. But the forensic focus here is on the physiology. When he arrived at the hospital in the morning, nurses and assisting staff began to notice specific biological anomalies. They noticed the sweat. Not the perspiration of a humid Texas morning, but a chemical sweat, erratic, profuse, and out of place in the air-conditioned chill of the hospital corridor. And then the eyes. You might be lying in the dark right now, trusting your own body to regulate itself. But consider the autonomic nervous system. It reacts to stimuli. When we are calm, our pupils constrict. When we are in fight or flight, or when we are under the influence of strong central nervous system stimulants, the pupils dilate. They become saucers, swallowing the iris. Staff members recall looking into his eyes and seeing that dilation. This creates a terrifying open loop for us to consider. Imagine you are a nurse. You see the surgeon. You see the sweat. You see the dilated pupils. You know instinctively that something is wrong. But he is the surgeon. He brings in the revenue. He has the PhD. Here is the question I want you to weigh in your mind. At what point does observation become obligation? If you see a pilot stumbling toward the cockpit, you call security. But in the rigid hierarchy of medicine, the subordinate is trained to doubt their own eyes before they doubt the superior. The evidence suggests he was operating under a chemical fog. He was bringing the chaos of his night into the precision of the morning. This was not just a bad habit. This was a systematic dismantling of his own ability to function. The why starts to become clearer. It wasn't just incompetence, it was impairment. He was a man walking on a wire, high above the ground, with no net, carrying his patients on his back, and he was swaying. In the next section of our investigation, we will move from the psychological symptoms to the physical trauma. We are going to examine the first major casualty of this descent. We will look at what happens when a friend, a person who knew him, loved him, and trusted him, places their neck in his hands. The rain is picking up speed now. The windshield is blurring. We are about to enter the operating room again, and this time the damage will be personal. If you are feeling a heaviness, a sadness for what is coming, that is the correct response. It means your empathy is intact, something Christopher Dunch had long since abandoned. We are now opening Case File A. If you are comfortable, I want you to picture the concept of trust. Not the abstract idea, but the physical weight of it. Trust is handing someone the keys to your house. It is letting someone hold your wallet while you swim. But the ultimate form of trust, the absolute peak of human vulnerability, is allowing another person to render you unconscious, cut into your body, and manipulate the nerves that control your ability to breathe, move, and feel. Usually, this trust is given to a stranger based on credentials. But, in this case, the trust was built on a lifetime of history. The victim is Jerry Summers. To understand the betrayal, we must profile the victim. Jerry was not just a patient. He was Christopher Dunch's childhood friend from Tennessee. They had played football together in the muddy fields of high school. When Dunch decided to move to Dallas to start his neurosurgery practice, Jerry Summers dropped everything to go with him. He believed in the dream. He was Dunch's assistant, his roommate, and his biggest champion. He would tell anyone who would listen that his friend was a genius, a man who would change medicine. So, when Jerry began to suffer from chronic neck pain, there was no question of who would perform the surgery. He didn't shop around. He didn't look for a second opinion. He placed his life in the hands of the man he had known since they were boys. The procedure scheduled was an anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, often abbreviated as ACDF. Let us pause for a moment of forensic education. An ACDF is considered the bread and butter of spinal surgery. It is a common, well-mapped procedure. The surgeon approaches the spine from the front of the throat, moving the windpipe and the esophagus gently to the side to access the damaged disc. The goal is to remove the bad disc and replace it with a small cage or bone graft to fuse the vertebrae together. In the hands of a competent surgeon, it is a delicate but routine dance. The anatomy here is crowded: the carotid artery, the jugular vein, the recurrent laryngeal nerve, but the path is known. Jerry Summers was wheeled into the operating room at Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano. He was joking with the staff. He was confident. Now we must examine the how of the error. We are not looking at a slip of the hand. We are looking at a fundamental dismantling of anatomical structure. As Dunch began the procedure, the observation from the assisting staff shifted from routine to alarm. A typical ACDF involves minimal blood loss, perhaps 25 to 50 milliliters. It is a dry, clean field. Observe this. The anesthesia logs from that day record a blood loss that defies explanation for this specific surgery. Over 1,200 milliliters. That is more than a liter of blood in a neck surgery. The evidence suggests that Dunch became lost in the anatomy. Instead of gently dissecting the tissue planes, he began to remove muscle that should have been left acts as a shield. He compromised the vertebral artery, a critical vessel supplying blood to the brain. The bleeding was torrential. But the most devastating error, the forensic detail that makes this case unique in its tragedy, was how he attempted to stop that bleeding. There is a substance used in surgery called gelfoam. It is a sponge-like material used to promote clotting. It is meant to be used sparingly. Dunch took large amounts of this foam and packed it into the surgical site. He packed it so tightly and in such volume that he effectively built a wall of pressure. But he didn't pack it against the bone. He packed it against the spinal cord. Imagine a garden hose carrying water. If you step on it, the flow stops. The spinal cord carries the electrical signals for movement. By packing the gelfoam into that tight space, he created a constriction. He was strangling the spinal cord of his best friend. The surgery ended. Dunch closed the incision. He felt, by his own account, that it had gone well. This is the narrative gap again, the space between what he believed and what was real. When the anesthesia wore off, the reality in the recovery room was stark. Jerry Summers woke up, but his body did not. He could not move his arms. He could not move his legs. He was experiencing what we call tetraplegia paralysis of all four limbs. The signals were firing from his brain, screaming for his hands to lift, but they were hitting the wall of pressure Dunch had installed in his neck. Summers was in agony. He began to scream, not just in pain, but in the terrifying realization of his entrapment. He yelled, "I can't move. I can't feel my legs." Now, place yourself in the shoes of the surgeon. Your best friend is lying in the ICU, paralyzed by your hand. The normal human reaction is horror. It is guilt. It is a desperate, frantic need to fix it. You would sleep on the floor next to his bed. You would demand new scans. you would be weeping. We look to the criminal profile for the reaction. Christopher Dunch did not weep. He did not panic. He appeared, according to witnesses, to be annoyed. He dismissed the paralysis as temporary. He claimed it was just swelling. He refused to acknowledge the catastrophic nature of the injury, and then he did something that forces us to question the presence of a conscience entirely. While Jerry Summers lay in the ICU, unable to scratch his own nose, unable to feed himself, struggling to breathe, Christopher Dunch left the hospital. He did not go home to rest. He did not go to the medical library to research how to help his friend. He boarded a plane to Las Vegas. He had a conference to attend, a social engagement. The lights of the strip, the noise of the casino, the flow of alcohol, he chose this over the bedside of the man who had trusted him with his life. This is a displacement activity. It is a psychological defense mechanism where the mind refuses to accept the trauma it has caused, so it flees to a place of artificial joy. Jerry Summers would never regain the full use of his limbs. He would spend the rest of his life dependent on caregivers, trapped in the prison of his own body, a living monument to his friends' incompetence. The betrayal was total. It was physical, it was emotional, and it was permanent. We are approaching the midpoint of this case file. As we move into the fatal surgeries, take a moment to adjust your volume or screen brightness. Ensure you are comfortable as we descend deeper into the negligence. The rain outside is heavy now. The world is dark. And in that darkness, Christopher Dunch returned from Las Vegas, not humbled, but emboldened. He believed he was untouchable, and for a terrifyingly long time, the system proved him right. Stay with me. The worst is yet to come. We have now crossed a threshold in our investigation. If you are listening to this in the quiet of your bedroom, I want you to appreciate the safety of your environment. You are in control. If you are cold, you pull up the blanket. If you are thirsty, you reach for water. But when a patient enters an operating room, they surrender all agency. They become an object in the care of a subject. We are opening Case File B. The name on the file is Kelly Martin. To understand the weight of this loss, we must first build the profile of the victim. Kelly was 55 years old. She was not a risk-taker. She was a beloved school teacher, a librarian, a woman who had spent her life curating knowledge and nurturing children. She was the kind of person who followed the rules. She had a husband who adored her and adult daughters who looked up to her. She was suffering from back pain. It was a common ailment, the kind that naggingly interrupts a life but doesn't usually threaten it. She sought relief. She found Christopher Dunch. The date is the 12th of March, 2012. The location is Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano, Texas. The procedure scheduled was a simple microdiscectomy. Check this out. In the hierarchy of neurosurgical risks, a microdiscectomy is considered low tier. It is a routine maintenance procedure. A skilled surgeon makes a small incision, moves the muscle aside, removes the fragment of herniated disc that is pressing on the nerve, and closes up. It is often done as an outpatient procedure. The patient walks in, has the surgery, and is often home in time for dinner. The expected runtime is roughly 45 minutes. It is the surgical equivalent of changing a tire. Kelly Martin kissed her husband goodbye in the pre-op holding area. She told him she would see him soon. That was the last time they would ever speak. As the anesthesia took hold and the room settled into its sterile rhythm, the relatable nightmare anchor sets in. You go in for something minor, expecting a cure, and you never wake up. Dunch began the incision. But almost immediately, the forensic timeline shows a deviation from standard protocol. We need to visualize the anatomy to understand the error. The spine is a column. Behind it are the nerves. In front of it, running down the front of the vertebral bodies, is a thick, fibrous band called the anterior longitudinal ligament. This ligament is the final barrier. It is the wall at the back of the house. Beyond that wall, resting just millimeters away, are the major blood vessels of the abdomen, specifically the common iliac arteries. These are the pipelines that carry blood from the heart to the legs. They are high-pressure systems. A neurosurgeon operating from the back, which is where Dunch was, should never, under any circumstances, breach that front wall. You stay within the disc space. You do not punch through. But Christopher Dunch did not respect boundaries. The evidence suggests that he was moving with a frantic, aggressive speed. He was not picking away at the disc. He was plunging into it. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. I want you to listen to the audio landscape of a crisis. It starts not with a scream, but with a sound from a machine. The suction device, which is usually a quiet, rhythmic hiss used to clear small amounts of fluid, began to make a wet, gurgling choke. It was struggling to keep up with the volume of fluid filling the surgical cavity. The fluid was bright red. The anesthesiologist, a doctor whose job is to keep the patient alive while the surgeon works, noticed the monitors. The blood pressure was dropping. The heart rate was climbing. These are the classic signs of hypovolemic shock. The tank is emptying. He spoke up. He told Dunch that the patient was losing blood. This brings us to the logic gap, the moment that criminal psychology struggles to explain. A normal surgeon, upon hearing that their patient is crashing, stops. They pack the wound. They call for a vascular surgeon. They hunt for the source of the bleed. They go into rescue mode. Christopher Dunch did not stop. He continued to work. He continued to scrape and pull instruments through a surgical field that was now completely obscured by pooling blood. He was flying blind. Imagine you are driving a car and a bucket of red paint hits your windshield. You cannot see the road. You cannot see the other cars. A rational person hits the brakes. Dunch hit the gas. He attributed the blood to a minor vessel. He dismissed the concerns of the anesthesiologist with a wave of his hand, continuing his aggressive dissection even as Kelly Martin's life was being pumped out of her body into a suction canister. The forensic investigation later revealed the horror of the anatomy. Dunch had punctured the anterior longitudinal ligament. He had gone through the bone, through the ligament, and sliced right into the common iliac artery. He was not fixing a disc. He was exsanguinating his patient. The impossible contradiction returns here. How does a man with a PhD in microneurosurgery not recognize the difference between a trickle and a torrent? The psychology suggests a state of dissociation. He was so committed to his identity as a perfect surgeon that he literally could not perceive the reality that contradicted it. To acknowledge the blood was to acknowledge his failure, and his ego would not permit that. So, he hallucinated a scenario where everything was fine. Kelly Martin's blood pressure bottomed out. The room descended into chaos. The code was called, chest compressions began. And where was Christopher Dunch? While the team fought a losing battle to restart Kelly Martin's heart, Dunch stepped back. He did not seem devastated. He seemed confused, perhaps, but detached. He wrote in his post-operative notes that are legally binding documents, that the surgery was uneventful, aside from some minor bleeding. Kelly Martin was pronounced dead. She came in for back pain. She left in a body bag. Her husband was waiting in the lobby. He had been watching the clock. 45 minutes had passed, then an hour, then 2. When the doctor finally came out, it wasn't to say that the surgery went well. It was to deliver the news that tears a family's reality in half. Now, here is the standout strategy for our analysis. We often think of killers as people who hunt in dark alleys, but there is a unique danger in the authorized killer, the one who kills you in a brightly lit room surrounded by witnesses with the permission of the state. Why wasn't he arrested right then and there? This is the question that should keep you awake. In the United States, medical malpractice is treated as a civil issue, not a criminal one. If you kill someone with a car because you are drunk, you go to jail. If you kill someone with a scalpel because you are incompetent, you get sued. The system insulated him. The hospital administration, faced with a dead patient and a liability nightmare, did not call the police. They did not strip his license immediately. They allowed him to resign. This is a critical maneuver in the corporate world of medicine. If they fired him, they would have to report him to the National Practitioner Data Bank. That would alert other hospitals. But if they allowed him to resign voluntarily, he could leave with a clean record. So, Christopher Dunch walked out of Baylor Plano. He packed his things. He left the grieving family behind. And because of that administrative silence, he was free to go down the road to the next hospital, to the next patient. He was a loaded weapon that had just gone off, and instead of dismantling it, the system simply put it back in the holster and handed it to someone else. As we end this case file, I want to ask you a rhetorical question. Who is more dangerous? The man holding the scalpel or the institution that watches him kill and opens the door for him to leave? The rain is drumming harder against the glass now. The investigation is far from over. There are more victims. There is more silence. And as we will see in the next chapter, the violence is about to escalate. Settle in deeper. The night is long, and we have only just begun to uncover the extent of the damage. We are leaving the operating room now. We are walking down the long, quiet hallway to the administrative wing. The air here is different. It doesn't smell of antiseptic or blood. It smells of coffee, toner ink, and expensive carpet. If you are drifting off, let the sound of the rain against the window deepen. We are shifting our investigation from the visceral violence of the knife to the cold, calculated violence of the pen. We must now examine the systemic failure. This is the invisible accomplice. After the death of Kelly Martin, you might assume that the hospital, Baylor Plano, would immediately lock the doors. You might assume they would call the Texas Medical Board, the police, the press, anyone who would listen and scream that there is a dangerous man in the building. But institutions do not scream. They calculate. We are looking at a concept known as the administrative shield. The executives at Baylor were faced with a dilemma. They had a surgeon who had just killed a patient during a routine procedure. If they fired him, if they terminated his privileges for cause, they would be legally obligated to report him to the National Practitioner Data Bank. Watch this. The National Practitioner Data Bank, or NPDB, is a federal repository. It is the permanent record for doctors. If a name goes in there with a red flag, every other hospital in the country can see it. It is a career death sentence. It is the system working as designed to protect the public. But reporting him comes with a cost. It invites a lawsuit from the doctor for wrongful termination. It admits liability. It opens the books. So, the administrators at Baylor made a choice. It was a choice based on risk management, not patient safety. They called Christopher Dunch into an office. They did not put him in handcuffs. They put a piece of paper in front of him. They offered him a deal. Resign voluntarily, right now, and we will not report you. Dunch, protecting his own future, signed the paper. He walked out of that hospital with a clean record. The death of Kelly Martin was, in the eyes of the data bank, a non-event. The system did not just fail. It actively conspired to hide the truth. This legal loophole is the how. It is how a predator moves through the tall grass without making a sound. The hospital washed its hands of him. They solved their problem, but by doing so, they exported the danger to the rest of the community. This brings us to a phenomenon in medical ethics known as the passing of the trash. It is a crude term, but accurate. It describes the practice of shuffling an incompetent or dangerous doctor from one facility to another to avoid litigation. Christopher Dunch drove down the highway. He still had his medical license. He still had his confident smile. He still had the glowing references from his residency. And because Baylor had chosen silence over safety, he had a record that looked spotless. He arrived at the Dallas Medical Center. They saw the revenue potential. They saw the neurosurgeon. They did not see the trail of bodies because the previous hospital had erased the tracks. They granted him temporary privileges within days. I want to offer you an analogy to help you visualize this dynamic. Imagine a game of hot potato. Children toss an object around a circle, terrified of being the one holding it when the music stops. But in this game, played by men in suits in boardrooms, the potato was a loaded gun, and the players were hospital administrators protecting their liability insurance. They threw the gun to the next hospital. They didn't unload it. They didn't lock the safety. They just threw it, and the next hospital caught it, completely unaware that the trigger was already being pulled. Here is the rhetorical question for this chapter. If a man commits a crime, and the witness accepts a silent resignation to let him leave, is the witness not also guilty? The forensic timeline shows that within weeks of leaving Baylor, Dunch was scrubbing in at Dallas Medical Center. The rain is falling harder now, obscuring the view. The stage is set for a repetition of history. The same credentials, the same hands, the same arrogance, but a new operating room and new unsuspecting victims. This section of the story is not about blood. It is about the ink. It is about how a signature on a resignation letter can be just as lethal as a severed artery. As we prepare to witness the next tragedy, I want you to feel the weight of that administrative silence. It is a heavy, suffocating blanket, and under that blanket, Christopher Dunch was preparing to operate again. We have now traveled a great distance together in this investigation. We have walked the halls of the medical school in Tennessee, stood in the administrative offices where liability was weighed against safety, and witnessed the silence of the system. Now, the narrative arc bends back upon itself. We are returning to the beginning. We are returning to the impossible contradiction. If you are lying in the dark, let your mind drift back to the image we started with, the sterile operating theater in July 2012. The rain is still falling against the glass of our detective car, but we are no longer looking at the outside of the hospital. We are going inside. We are back in the room with Mary Eford. When we first met her in the opening minutes of this file, we saw the aftermath, the chaotic CT scan. But now, armed with the knowledge of Christopher Dunch's history, his training, and his psychological erosion, we must witness the cause. We must watch the hands of the surgeon as they move. Mary Eford was 71 years old. She had trusted Dr. Dunch to perform a spinal fusion to relieve her pain. She wanted to be able to walk without hurting. A spinal fusion is a structural intervention. It involves placing screws, known as pedicle screws, into the vertebrae and connecting them with rods. It is carpentry on a biological scale. The screws must be placed with absolute precision. If you go too far medial toward the center, you hit the spinal canal. If you go too far lateral, you miss the anchor point entirely. Dunch began the procedure. Pay keen attention. A seasoned neurosurgeon relies heavily on tactile feedback. When you drill into bone, there is a specific resistance. It vibrates up the instrument and into the fingertips. It tells you where you are without you having to see it. It is a language of touch. But as Dunch worked on Mary Eford, the evidence suggests he was deaf to this language. He began to insert the pedicle screws, but he did not place them into the bone. He placed them into the soft tissue. He placed them into the muscle. Imagine trying to hang a heavy shelf on a wall, but instead of finding the stud, you simply push the screw into the drywall. It holds for a second, but it has no strength. It is floating. But the incompetence did not stop at the hardware. It extended to the biological material itself. During the dissection, Dunch encountered a nerve root. The nerve root is the lifeline. It is the cable that carries the signal from the brain to the leg. To a neurosurgeon, it is sacred. You work around it. You protect it. You retract it gently. Dunch looked at the nerve root, and in a moment that defies every hour of training he supposedly endured, he did not recognize it. He mistook the nerve root for a piece of bone that needed to be removed. He took his tool, an amputation instrument, and he severed it. He did not just nick it. He did not just compress it. He removed a segment of the nerve that controlled the movement of Mary Eford's foot. The room was filled with the beep of monitors, the hiss of the ventilator, and the movements of a man who believed he was performing surgery, while in reality he was performing a mutilation. Mary Eford woke up in excruciating pain. She could not move her foot. She could not stand. She was worse than when she arrived. And once again, the standout strategy of Dunch's psychology appeared. He did not investigate. He did not panic. He blamed the patient. He claimed she was fine, but the body does not lie. 2 days later, Dr. Robert Henderson was called in. We mentioned Dr. Henderson earlier, but now we must listen to his internal monologue as he opened Mary Eford's back to see what had happened. Henderson is a man of precision. He expects to see anatomy. When he opened the incision, he found what he later described in court with a trembling disbelief. He found the hardware loose, moving around in the muscle like spare change in a pocket. He found screw holes drilled into the wrong places, and he found the end of the nerve root, cut cleanly, floating in the void. He stood over the table, staring at the wreckage of another surgeon's work, and he realized that the narrative gap he had been trying to fill, the question of how could a doctor be this bad, had a terrifying answer. This was not a bad surgery. This was not a complication. Dr. Henderson later stated he had done virtually everything wrong. Pause on that phrase, virtually everything. In a complex system, even a novice gets some things right by accident. To get everything wrong requires a special kind of anti-talent. Henderson realized he was not looking at malpractice. Malpractice implies a mistake made by a competent person. This was different. This was an assault. If I walked up to you on the street and cut your nerve with a knife, it would be a crime. Henderson realized that the fact that Dunch was wearing scrubs did not change the nature of the act. It only changed the setting. He took photos. He documented the damage. He knew, in that moment, that he had a moral obligation that superseded the professional code of silence. He had to stop him. But here is the open loop that remains. Dr. Henderson was just one man. He was an outsider to the specific administrative structure that had protected Dunch for so long. Could he break through the shield? Could he force the system to see what he was seeing? The surgery on Mary Eford was the turning point. It was the moment where the damage became so undeniable, so forensic, that it could no longer be filed away as an unfortunate outcome. As we close this file on the surgical reveal, I want you to feel the shift in the wind. The rain is stopping. The storm is breaking. But what is left in the wake of the storm is a landscape of broken lives. The investigation is about to move from the hospital to the courtroom. We are going to leave the sterile silence of the OR and enter the noisy, adversarial world of the legal system. The question is no longer, how did he do it? The question is now, how do we stop him? The final confrontation is approaching. We have arrived at the end of the line. The rain that has accompanied us on this long drive through the dark streets of Dallas is finally tapering off. The engine of the car is cooling. We are stepping out of the vehicle and walking up the steps of the Frank Crowley Courts building. The operating theater is a place of silence and stainless steel, but the courtroom is a place of mahogany and recorded words. It is here that society attempts to apply logic to chaos. We must now conduct the post-mortem, not on a body, but on the career of Christopher Dunch. In the history of American jurisprudence, what happened in this building was a statistical anomaly. It was a precedent that shifted the tectonic plates of medical law. Usually, when a doctor maims a patient, it is handled in civil court. Money changes hands. Non-disclosure agreements are signed. The doctor moves on. But the Dallas District Attorney's Office looked at the file, specifically the file of Mary Eford, and they saw something that transcended malpractice. They saw a weapon. The charge they brought was unique: injury to an elderly individual. This was a strategic masterstroke. To charge him with attempted murder, they would have to prove he specifically intended for the patient to die. That is a high bar. A defense attorney could argue he was trying to help but failed. But by charging him with injury to an elderly person and using the deadly weapon enhancement, arguing that his hands and his scalpel were, in fact, weapons, they opened the door to a sentence that matched the severity of the trauma: life imprisonment. The trial began in February 2017. I want you to visualize the defendant. He sat at the table wearing a suit that looked slightly too large, stripping away the authority of the white coat he had worn for so long. Without the scrubs, without the hospital badge, he was just a man who had to listen to the people he had broken tell their stories. Jerry Summers, speaking from his wheelchair through a deposition. Mary Eford, pointing to her feet that would never move correctly again. Dr. Henderson, explaining the anatomy of the errors with the cold precision of a forensic scientist. The defense tried to argue that Christopher Dunch was simply a bad surgeon. They tried to paint him as a tragic figure, a man who was overwhelmed, poorly trained, and struggling with the pressure. They argued that stupidity is not a crime, but the prosecution dismantled that narrative. They argued that when you know you are dangerous, when you have been told by your peers that you are dangerous, and you continue to pick up the knife, that is not incompetence. That is malice. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. In a case that spanned years of evidence, thousands of pages of medical records, and dozens of witnesses, it took 12 ordinary citizens just an afternoon to see the truth that the hospital administrators had spent years ignoring. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was life in prison. Christopher Dunch, the man who dreamed of building a medical empire, the man who believed he was a mix of Einstein and God, was escorted out of the courtroom. He will likely die in a concrete cell, far away from the sterile lights of the operating room. The system finally worked, but only after it had failed repeatedly. As we close this case file, I want to leave you with a final thought to carry into sleep. It is a thought about the nature of vulnerability. We live in a world where we must trust others to survive. We trust the pilot to land the plane. We trust the chef not to poison the food. But there is no trust more profound, more absolute, than the trust we place in a doctor. Return to the quiet, dark room in your mind. Imagine the moment the gurney rolls into the theater. The lights are bright. The faces are covered by masks. You are asked to count backward from 10. 10, 9, 8. When the anesthesia mask lowers and the world fades to black, you are handing your life to a stranger. You trust the degree on the wall. You trust the hospital's logo. You assume that the person standing over you is a guardian. In the case of Christopher Dunch, that trust was the weapon. He did not need a gun. He just needed your permission. It is a heavy reality, but acknowledging it allows us to see the value of true competence, of the doctors who do respect the boundary, who do stop when they see blood. They are the silent guardians who keep the darkness at bay. Tonight, we have shined a light into the corner of that darkness. The file is now closed. The rain has stopped. The city is asleep. This concludes our examination of file number the 17th of September, 2015. If this story kept you company in the dark, please signal the algorithm by liking the video. And also subscribe so we can open more files like this. Sleep well and stay vigilant.